to the workshop. Hi, this video is on the method of cutting a lapped dovetail. Lapped dovetails are commonly used on drawers where the front of a drawer meets the side of a drawer. The dovetail joint gives good mechanical strength for this front joint in a drawer. However, we don't really want to see the end grain of tails popping through the front of our drawer. If we create a lap on the front of our drawer is uninterrupted and looks very good, and we only see the tails from the side. So we need to connect this piece with tails a little bit back from the front of the drawer front. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark a line approximately 4 millimeters back from the front of the drawer. And I use the same setting on my marking gauge to mark a line right around the joint end of the side. Another important point to notice on a drawer is that we normally have a groove for the base to fit into. I don't have a groove on this board, but I've marked where it might be, approximately 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom and about between 1/8 and 3/16 wide in this case. And I think you can see where I've marked that. That groove will normally be milled before we make the drawer, and therefore will extend right the way through the end of the drawer front. To cover up that groove, we make sure that the bottom tail on our tail board falls in the same area. And that will cover up the end of the groove. So to make sure that happens, we'll line up the side with the front and just transfer the groove markings onto the side. And then I'll just extend those back to the line that we just marked with our marking gauge. Now we have to make sure that our tail includes all of this area. So we'll take our dovetail marking gauge, and if we just move it across until we can't see that line, and I think you can see that, and we can mark for that side of the dovetail. Now for a consistent layout, I want the same spacing at the other end. So I'm going to gauge this distance to the knife line and transfer it to the top side of the drawer side, and then use dovetail marker again to mark the end of the other tail. Now, to evenly space the dovetails, and I'm going to put 2 tails on this board, I want to split the board in half, and this board is a little over 3 inches wide, so I'm going to tilt my ruler slightly so that the 3-inch mark and the 0 mark are exactly on the edges, and so the 1.5 inches gives me the midpoint on the board, and I'll just mark that. Now, to ensure there's plenty of room to chisel out the gap between our tails, and I'm going to be using this 1/8 of an inch bevel edge chisel for that, I'm going to leave approximately 3/16 between the pins. So I'll just mark those on there. And then finish marking off for the tails. Now I can square the marks for the end of the tails across the end of our board. And now we're ready to cut the tails. Put the work in our vise. Get it standing up nice and square. And now I've got the dovetail saw, which I created in the simple dovetail saw video. And I'm just going to cut the ends of those tails. So staying in the waist side of the line, this is tricky here because there's a very small gap at the end, so I'll start it across to our line and then stand the saw up. Take a piercing saw, chop out the majority of the waste in between the tails, now to remove the waste at the ends, going to use a chisel against my marked line just to remove a little bit of material to create a shoulder for my saw to sit in. And then we can saw that. Same at the other end. A piece of waste to protect my bench, and we'll clamp this down. Just take the chisel and chop to the line. Let's take a little bit more waste out first before we get to the line. Bring about halfway through, then resting the chisel in the line. Flip that over. And complete the chopping. Back in the vise. Now we just take a chisel to work from our gauged line. Just to make a lovely flat, perfectly flat joint. Rest it on the gauged line and just press it. Firm pressure. Holding the chisel between your thumb and forefinger, you can just break it before you go too far. A little bit of cleaning out in the middle as well. To get nicely up into the corners. And that's good. Now we need to transfer those dovetails to the front of our work. So place the front of the work in the vise. Use a little spacer and move that spacer back and place our side on there. Line up with our marked line and marking the corners of our joint up. Just checking that everything is nice and true as well on the edges. That's good. Plenty of pressure down on the board. And taking our very pointed marking knife, this is a Japanese one, we could use a scalpel instead. Just transfer the tail marks onto the pin board. Mark out the areas to take away. And I like to just put a little extra mark in with the pencil, just so I can see it a bit easier. I do that on the waist side of the marked line. And now I want to extend those lines down the back of the drawer front. Now, to mark for how far we have to cut down, I'll reset my marking gauge and take that to the width of our side, and then gauge a line at the base of those tails. Now, with the depth of the pins marked, we can now go and cut that. And this is going to be difficult to show you, but we need to follow with the saw along the mark of the, or on the waist side of the mark on the end of the front board, whilst also following down the perpendicular line along the length of the front board. So hopefully you will be able to see I'm staying on the waist side but cutting up to my line and following the perpendicular line until I meet the gauge lines both down the side and the inside of the drawer face. I'll do this one over here as well so you can see that. cut on the waste side of the line. Now to chop out the waste, we'll clamp the work onto the bench. Here to the top of one of the legs, so there's plenty of support. And then we'll slowly chop away vertical chopping. We're just staying shy of the correct depth that we want to go to. And you should hear a slight change in the note that you get when you're chopping, when you get down to the previous height that you've chopped. What you can do is put some tape around your chisel at the right depth. Or you can just rely on the change of tone, which is what I'm doing here. Getting close to the gauge line. And we sneak up on it gently. Our last chop should be really quite close to that line. And eventually feel it into the line. And chop straight down. And before I clear out this one, I'll take the bulk of the material out of the other pin. So that is the majority of the waste out now. I'm going to clamp it back in the vise and then slowly just pare back to the line and make my way down the depth of the pin and carefully cut into the corners. And I'll use a couple of skew chisels to get right up into the corners. So just very carefully paring away back to the lap line. I put a little score across with the chisel there, then I can come down with the grain because I know it's not going to split out too far. And again, a little score. Cutting into the corners, using a skew chisel here makes life a little bit easier. And you're working the area now where you weren't able to get to with the saw, right up into the corner. Use the flat that you chopped earlier as a reference, hold the chisel down tight to it and just advance slowly into that corner. And then you can shred that waste away bit by bit. And you can use the stock on your square to make sure you're getting right up into those corners. But once you've had a bit of practice, you do get quicker at it. I haven't cut one of these joints for quite some time, and so I'm rather slow today. But certainly if you have half a dozen drawers to do, by the time you get to the last one, you'll be going a lot quicker. Always reference the flat of your chisel back against the surface that you know is correct, and slowly move your chisel along. Helps you to keep a nice flat surface. When you get up close to the pin, you can feed your chisel into the knife line, holding it tight against the pin. Just pare off a thin shaving to get closer and closer to your line and keep the side of the pin nice and flat. And I think that's ready to glue up. Once the glue's set, a little work with a smoothing plane. Soon cleans our joint up. The top and bottom surfaces are almost perfectly flush, but I'll just plane around them just to finish it off. And that's lovely. And that's lovely. A lapped dovetail joint. Give it a go.